1. Biltmore's magnificent facade and hidden cost. The Biltmore estate stands today as America's largest privately owned home, a testament to Gilded Age excess and architectural ambition that continues to captivate over 1 million visitors annually. Its limestone facade, stretching across 175,000 square feet of living space, rises from the Blue Ridge Mountains like a French Renaissance chateau transplanted to the American South. Yet beneath this breathtaking exterior lies a complex story of staggering costs, both financial and human, that transformed a single man's dream into a burden that would challenge generations. When visitors approach Biltmore House along the carefully designed 3-mile entrance road, they experience what George Washington Vanderbilt II intended, a gradual revelation of grandeur. The house emerges slowly through Frederick Law Olmsted's masterfully planned landscape, its Indiana limestone walls glowing in the Carolina sunlight, its slate roof punctuated by copper-crested towers and Gothic spires. The statistics alone inspire awe. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and 3 kitchens spread across 4 acres of floor space. The facade features intricate carved details, gargoyles that seem to watch visitors approach, and a porte-cochere designed to welcome carriages and later automobiles in the grand European tradition. But these impressive numbers tell only part of the story. The true cost of Biltmore's magnificent facade extends far beyond its physical dimensions. The house consumed approximately $6 million to construct between 1889 and 1895, a sum that translates to well over $200 million in today's currency when accounting for inflation. Yet even this astronomical figure fails to capture the complete financial picture. The ongoing costs of maintaining such an estate, staffing it with dozens of servants, heating its vast spaces, and preserving its countless treasures would prove to be a perpetual drain that no single fortune, however vast, could indefinitely sustain. The hidden costs began accumulating from the moment George Vanderbilt conceived his vision. The land acquisition alone required years of patient negotiation and substantial capital. Vanderbilt ultimately assembled approximately 125,000 acres of mountain land, much of it degraded by decades of logging and agricultural overuse. The purchase price, the legal fees, the surveying costs, these preliminary expenses mounted before a single stone was laid. Then came the infrastructure. Roads had to be built, a private railway spur constructed, a brick factory established on site, and temporary housing erected for the army of workers who would spend 6 years bringing the dream to reality. The facade's Indiana limestone was selected for its durability and beauty, but transporting it hundreds of miles to the remote North Carolina mountains added exponentially to costs. Each carved detail required skilled stonemasons, many brought from Europe specifically for this project. The slate roof tiles were imported, the copper cresting custom fabricated, the lead-paned windows crafted by artisans whose expertise commanded premium wages. Every architectural flourish visible on the exterior, every gargoyle, every carved escutcheon, every decorative finial, represented hours of specialized labor and expensive materials. Inside, the costs multiplied further. The house contains an estimated 16 million pounds of limestone and brick. Its foundation alone required engineering feats unprecedented in American residential construction. The structural innovations necessary to support such weight, to span such vast interior spaces, to accommodate modern conveniences like electricity, central heating, and indoor plumbing, all while maintaining the aesthetic of a medieval French chateau, demanded constant problem-solving and expensive solutions. The hidden human cost deserves equal consideration. While we celebrate Richard Morris Hunt's architectural genius and Frederick Law Olmsted's landscape mastery, thousands of laborers, craftsmen, and artisans devoted years of their lives to Biltmore's construction. Many were local mountain people, suddenly drawn into industrial-scale construction work. Others were European immigrants with specialized skills. These workers faced dangerous conditions. Construction sites in the 1890s lacked modern safety regulations, and many suffered injuries or worse. The records are incomplete, but we know that at least one worker died during construction, and likely others perished in accidents that went undocumented. The facade also concealed social costs that would become apparent only with time. Biltmore represented a level of concentrated wealth that was beginning to trouble American democracy, while George Vanderbilt envisioned his estate as a model of scientific forestry and progressive land management. Critics saw it as a monument to inequality. The Vanderbilt fortune originated in steamships and railroads, industries built on brutal competition and, some argued, the exploitation of workers and customers alike. Every stone in Biltmore's facade represented a portion of wealth that some believed should have been more equitably distributed or heavily taxed. The timing of Biltmore's completion in 1895 placed it at the cusp of major social and political changes. The Gilded Age was giving way to the Progressive Era, a time when reformers increasingly questioned the vast disparities between America's wealthiest families and its working poor. While George Vanderbilt pursued his refined cultural interests in his mountain palace, labor strikes, economic depressions, and social unrest roiled American cities. The magnificent facade, intended to showcase the heights of human achievement in architecture and landscape design, began to symbolize something more troubling. The distance between America's classes had grown so vast that they seemed to inhabit different worlds entirely. The environmental cost, though less visible, was equally significant. The construction consumed vast quantities of natural resources. The brick factory on the estate produced millions of bricks, requiring enormous amounts of clay and fuel. The limestone quarrying in Indiana scarred landscapes far from North Carolina. The hardwood forests that provided interior paneling and flooring were harvested at a time when forestry practices prioritized immediate extraction over long-term sustainability. Even Olmsted's celebrated landscape restoration, while eventually healing degraded land, initially required massive earth-moving operations, the importation of countless plants and trees, and the redirection of water sources. Interventions that fundamentally altered the natural hydrology and ecology of the region. Perhaps the most poignant hidden cost was the burden of expectation that Biltmore's magnificent facade created. George Vanderbilt built this house to last for centuries, to serve as a family seat for generations of descendants. Yet in doing so, he created an inheritance that was simultaneously priceless and unpayable. His heirs would discover that maintaining such a facade required resources that even Vanderbilt wealth couldn't indefinitely provide, especially as American tax policy shifted to redistribute concentrated fortunes. The magnificent facade became a gilded cage, trapping future generations in an obligation to preserve what could barely be afforded. The irony is unmistakable. Biltmore's facade was designed to project permanence, stability, and timeless elegance. It succeeded magnificently in this aesthetic goal. Yet behind that facade lay a financial and social reality that was anything but stable. The house was obsolete almost from the moment of its completion. The lifestyle it was built to accommodate, with its enormous servant staff, its assumption of inherited wealth, its cultural references to European aristocracy, was already being challenged by the early 20th century. The facade promised immortality, but delivered a constant struggle for survival. Today, when we admire Biltmore's magnificent exterior, we're seeing the result of continuous, expensive preservation efforts. The limestone requires regular cleaning and repair. The slate roof needs periodic replacement. The copper elements must be maintained to prevent deterioration. The windows, the woodwork, the stonework, every element demands attention. The estate employs a full-time preservation team, supported by entrance fees from those million-plus annual visitors. The facade remains magnificent, but it persists only through constant vigilance and substantial ongoing investment. This tension between beauty and burden defines the Biltmore story. The estate's creators succeeded in their aesthetic ambitions beyond reasonable expectation. They produced something genuinely magnificent, a structure that continues to inspire wonder more than a century after its completion. Yet they also created something that raises uncomfortable questions about sustainability: financial, social, and environmental. Can beauty justify such costs? Should private individuals be permitted to concentrate such resources in single projects? What obligations do we have to preserve monuments that represent troubling aspects of our history alongside their undeniable artistic achievements? These questions become more pressing as we contemplate Biltmore's future. The estate has survived thus far through a combination of family determination, savvy business management, and the conversion of the property into a tourist destination. The magnificent facade now serves primarily as a backdrop for visitors' photographs and a symbol of a vanished age. It has been preserved, but in a form its creator likely never imagined. No longer a private home, but a public spectacle. No longer a family retreat, but a commercial enterprise. The hidden cost of this transformation includes the loss of the very privacy and exclusivity that originally defined Biltmore's purpose. George Vanderbilt built this house to escape the public eye, to create a private world where he could pursue his scholarly interests surrounded by beauty and culture. Today's Biltmore serves exactly the opposite function. It exists to be seen, to generate revenue through admission fees, to host weddings and corporate events, to sell wine and crafts and Christmas decorations. The magnificent facade remains, but the meaning behind it has fundamentally changed. Understanding Biltmore's hidden costs doesn't diminish appreciation for its architectural and landscape achievements. Rather, it deepens our understanding of what this place represents. The facade tells a story of human ambition, artistic vision, and technical mastery. But it also tells a story about the limits of private wealth, the obligations created by grand gestures, and the unexpected ways that history can transform the meaning of our monuments. Every visitor who marvels at Biltmore's magnificent exterior is witnessing both a triumph and a cautionary tale, a dream realized, and the complex legacy that dreams leave behind. Second Christmas, 1895, the zenith of a dream. Christmas Eve, 1895, marked the unofficial opening of Biltmore House, and in that moment, George Washington Vanderbilt II stood at the absolute pinnacle of his achievement. After 6 years of intensive construction, countless obstacles overcome, and millions of dollars invested, his vision had finally materialized. The house was not yet complete in every detail. Some rooms remained unfinished. Portions of the landscape still showed raw earth where gardens would eventually bloom. But it was ready enough to host its first Christmas celebration, a carefully orchestrated event that would represent the zenith of Vanderbilt's dreams. And though no one knew it then, perhaps the high water mark of Gilded Age architectural ambition. The approach to the house that December evening must have been magical. Olmsted's winding entrance road, designed to build anticipation through carefully framed views, would have been lined with evergreens and illuminated by lanterns. As carriages rounded the final curve, the house itself would have emerged from the darkness, its windows glowing with the newly installed electric lights, a modern marvel in 1895, especially in the rural South. The banquet hall's massive fireplace, carved from limestone and rising several stories high, would have been ablaze, its light visible through the tall Gothic windows. The entire scene would have evoked a European fairy tale, a medieval castle transported to the Blue Ridge Mountains. George Vanderbilt's guest list for this inaugural celebration reflected his carefully cultivated social position. His mother, Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, traveled from New York to witness her youngest child's extraordinary accomplishment. His siblings attended, though some harbored private doubts about George's massive investment in an estate so far removed from New York's social orbit. Architect Richard Morris Hunt was there, aging now but justifiably proud of what many considered his masterwork. His presence connected this American chateau to the highest traditions of architectural practice. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and brought that rigorous training to every detail of Biltmore's design. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect, could not attend due to declining health, but his influence pervaded the entire approach to the house. The journey through his designed landscape, from the entrance gates through managed forests and open meadows to the suddenly revealed mansion, represented his philosophy that landscape should tell a story and create an emotional journey. That Christmas Eve, guests experienced the culmination of Olmsted's narrative. Arrival at a destination worthy of the journey, a moment of revelation that justified the anticipation. The guests who entered Biltmore that evening stepped into a world of unprecedented opulence and refinement. The entrance hall, with its enormous oak table, its massive chandelier, its Pellegrini ceiling painting, announced immediately that this was no ordinary American home. Moving into the winter garden, with its glass ceiling, its carved limestone, its fountain, and its collection of palms and tropical plants, visitors encountered a space that challenged conventional categories, neither interior nor exterior, neither conservatory nor drawing room. It was something entirely new in American domestic architecture. The banquet hall represented the emotional and spatial center of the Christmas celebration. This vast room, 72 feet long with a 70-foot-high, barrel-vaulted ceiling, was designed specifically for grand entertaining. That first Christmas evening, it must have glowed with candlelight and firelight. The massive table, which could seat 64 guests, laden with silver and crystal. The walls, lined with Flemish tapestries, created an atmosphere of medieval grandeur. The pipe organ, built into the gallery above, could fill the space with music. The entire room declared that this was a place built for celebration, for bringing people together, for creating moments that would live in memory. Yet even amid the celebration, subtle signs hinted at tensions and challenges ahead. The house was enormous, almost absurdly so. Heating it adequately during a Carolina winter tested the capabilities of even the most advanced heating systems of the era. The servant staff required to maintain such an establishment numbered in the dozens, and coordinating their activities demanded organizational skills approaching those of a small hotel. The electrical system, while impressive, was still experimental and prone to malfunctions. The very modernity that Vanderbilt had embraced, electricity, central heating, modern plumbing, created new vulnerabilities and required specialized knowledge to maintain. For George Vanderbilt himself, this Christmas represented the realization of a deeply personal vision. Unlike his older brothers, who had pursued business and social prominence in New York, George had always been something of an outsider in his own family. Shy, scholarly, more interested in art and literature than in commerce or society, he had used his inherited wealth to create something that reflected his own values and interests. Biltmore was to be a retreat, a place where he could house his growing collection of books, eventually more than 20,000 volumes, display his art collection, pursue scientific forestry, and live according to his own refined tastes rather than society's expectations. The Christmas 1895 celebration thus had a deeply personal dimension. George was showing his family and friends that his approach to life, however unconventional for a Vanderbilt, had produced something magnificent. He was proving that wealth could be used to create beauty, to advance knowledge, to model sustainable land management, and to build something that would endure. The house itself was his argument for a different kind of aristocracy, one based on culture, learning, and stewardship, rather than merely business success and social display. The celebration followed Christmas traditions with elaborate precision. The Christmas tree, a massive evergreen decorated in the European style, stood in the banquet hall. Gifts were exchanged, probably including items that reflected George's sophisticated tastes, perhaps first editions for the bibliophiles, fine wine from his wine cellar, already stocked with European vintages, or examples of the arts and crafts being produced in the estate's workshops. The dinner itself would have been a culinary event, prepared by a staff of professional chefs in Biltmore's state-of-the-art kitchens and served on fine china by liveried footmen. Music played a central role. George Vanderbilt was a lover of classical music and had installed multiple organs throughout the house, including the magnificent instrument in the banquet hall. That first Christmas almost certainly featured musical performances, perhaps including traditional carols sung by a choir assembled for the occasion. The acoustics of the banquet hall, designed with musical performances in mind, would have allowed every note to resonate through that vast space. Yet even in this moment of triumph, George Vanderbilt must have felt some trepidation. The house had already cost far more than originally projected. The ongoing expenses would be substantial. And while Biltmore represented everything he had wanted to create, it also represented an enormous commitment to maintain the property, to justify the investment, to validate his vision against inevitable skeptics. The Christmas celebration was a zenith, but zeniths, by definition, represent the highest point before descent begins. The contrast between the house's magnificence and the surrounding region's poverty would not have been lost on thoughtful observers. Asheville, in 1895, was a small mountain town, largely isolated from the industrialization and wealth creation of America's urban centers. The local population consisted primarily of farmers, small tradespeople, and laborers. Many had sold their exhausted land to Vanderbilt, grateful for the cash, but also displaced from property their families had held for generations. While Biltmore glowed with electric lights and warm fires, much of the surrounding population lived in conditions of genuine hardship. Vanderbilt was not oblivious to this disparity. His vision for Biltmore included ambitious plans for scientific forestry that would demonstrate sustainable land management, creating a model that could benefit the entire region. He had already hired Gifford Pinchot, a young forester trained in Europe, to begin rehabilitating the estate's degraded woodlands. He planned to establish a school for forestry, training a new generation of professionals who could spread these practices throughout the American South. These were genuine progressive impulses, reflecting a belief that great wealth carried responsibilities to society. But the tension remained. Could a private palace, however well-intentioned its owner's broader vision, truly serve the public good? Christmas 1895 at Biltmore represented the Gilded Age at its most refined, cultured, beautiful, progressive in its way, but also fundamentally private and exclusive. The gifts, the music, the magnificent rooms were enjoyed by a tiny elite, while the vast majority remained firmly outside the gates. The weather that Christmas added its own symbolism. The Blue Ridge Mountains in late December can be unpredictable, sometimes mild, sometimes brutally cold, sometimes shrouded in fog that obscures everything beyond a few feet. Whatever the specific conditions that night, they would have emphasized the house as a refuge, a warm and bright sanctuary against the darkness and cold outside. This had always been part of Vanderbilt's vision. Biltmore as a retreat from the world, a place apart where beauty and culture could flourish, protected from the harsh realities beyond its walls. The staff who made this Christmas celebration possible deserve recognition. While the guests enjoyed their evening, dozens of workers labored to maintain the illusion of effortless elegance. Cooks prepared the elaborate meal in kitchens located far from the dining areas to spare guests the heat and noise. Footmen served each course with practiced precision. Housemaids tended fires in dozens of fireplaces. Engineers monitored the heating and electrical systems. Outside, grooms cared for horses, and watchmen patrolled the grounds. The house functioned like a small village, with a clear hierarchy and division of labor that enabled the privileged few to enjoy their celebration. This division between served and servants, between those who enjoyed Biltmore and those who maintained it, would become increasingly problematic as the 20th century progressed. In 1895, such arrangements seemed natural to those who benefited from them. This was simply how great houses operated, how society was organized. But the growing labor movement, the rise of progressive politics, and the increasing questioning of extreme wealth disparities would all challenge these assumptions. The Christmas 1895 celebration represented not just the zenith of George Vanderbilt's dream, but also the zenith of an entire social order that would soon face serious challenges. The guests who departed Biltmore after that first Christmas carried memories of something extraordinary. They had witnessed architectural and landscape achievements of the highest order. They had experienced hospitality on a scale rarely seen in America. They had enjoyed an evening that seemed to transport them to an earlier era of European elegance while simultaneously showcasing the most modern American technologies and conveniences. For them, it must have seemed that George Vanderbilt had achieved something truly remarkable, a perfect synthesis of European culture and American innovation, a place where beauty and progress coexisted harmoniously. But perfect moments exist outside of time, and time would prove to be Biltmore's greatest challenge. The house was completed at precisely the moment when the social and economic assumptions that made it possible were beginning to erode. Within 2 decades, World War I would shatter the illusion that European culture represented the pinnacle of human civilization. The introduction of federal income tax in 1913 would fundamentally alter the economics of maintaining such estates. George Vanderbilt himself would die unexpectedly in 1914. Christmas 1895 at Biltmore thus represents a hinge point in American history. It was the culmination of Gilded Age ambition and the last moment before new realities intervened. The beauty created that night would endure, but its meaning would change. The dream would survive, but in forms its dreamer could not have anticipated. That first Christmas celebration was indeed the zenith, a moment of perfect realization before the long, complex process of adaptation began. 3. George Washington Vanderbilt II, an unconventional millionaire. To understand Biltmore Estate, one must first understand its creator, for George Washington Vanderbilt II was perhaps the most unconventional member of America's most prominent Gilded Age dynasty. Born on November 14, 1862, in New Dorp, Staten Island, George entered a world of extraordinary privilege, but chose to inhabit that world in ways that set him apart from his siblings and challenged contemporary expectations of how wealthy young men should behave. George was the youngest child of William Henry Vanderbilt, who had inherited and vastly expanded the railroad fortune created by his father, the legendary Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. By the time of William Henry's death in 1885, the Vanderbilt family had become synonymous with American wealth on an almost incomprehensible scale. William Henry left an estate valued at approximately $200 million, roughly $6 billion in today's terms, making him the wealthiest American of his era. This fortune was divided among his 8 surviving children, with George receiving approximately $10 million outright, plus substantial trust funds that would provide income for life. Yet George showed little interest in further accumulating wealth. While his older brothers pursued business careers and social prominence, building grand houses on Fifth Avenue, marrying into European aristocracy, collecting yachts and art to outdo each other, George remained studious, reserved, and focused on intellectual and cultural pursuits. His contemporaries found him bookish, somewhat withdrawn, and more comfortable in a library than at a society ball. These qualities, seen as weaknesses in the competitive Vanderbilt family dynamic, would ultimately enable George to create something none of his siblings could match. George's education reflected his scholarly bent. He was tutored privately at home, then traveled extensively throughout Europe with his mother after his father's death. These European tours were not mere pleasure trips, but serious educational journeys during which George studied languages, art, architecture, and literature. He became fluent in multiple languages, including French, German, and Italian. He developed a sophisticated appreciation for art and architecture, visiting great estates and museums, studying with experts, and building relationships with scholars and artists. Unlike many wealthy Americans who collected art as status symbols, George approached collecting as a scholar. His eventual library of more than 20,000 volumes included rare books, early printed works, and comprehensive holdings in subjects that interested him: forestry, agriculture, literature, architecture, and landscape design. These were working collections, books that George actually read and studied rather than merely displayed. His approach to art collecting followed the same pattern. He purchased works that genuinely interested him, studied their provenance and context, and assembled a collection that reflected personal taste rather than market trends or social competition. This scholarly approach extended to George's conception of Biltmore itself. While his brothers built grand houses in New York as stages for social competition, George envisioned something different: a private retreat where he could pursue knowledge, practice scientific forestry, create beauty, and live according to his own values. The location choice itself was revealing. Rather than building near other Vanderbilt properties or in established wealthy enclaves, George chose the mountains of North Carolina, a region relatively undeveloped and far from fashionable society. George had first visited Asheville with his mother in 1888, seeking the mountain air recommended for his health. He had always been somewhat frail and suffered from respiratory ailments, but he saw in the Blue Ridge Mountains something beyond therapeutic climate, an opportunity to create something entirely new. The degraded forests surrounding Asheville, once rich with hardwoods, but now exhausted by logging and poor agricultural practices, could be restored using the scientific forestry methods he had studied in Europe. The dramatic landscape could be transformed through careful design into something that honored both natural beauty and human artistry. His personality traits, which might have been limitations in business or politics, proved perfectly suited to the Biltmore project. His patience allowed him to envision a project that would take years to complete. His scholarly approach enabled him to work effectively with experts like Richard Morris Hunt and Frederick Law Olmsted, appreciating their professional knowledge rather than trying to override their judgment with owners' prerogatives. His genuine interest in forestry and agriculture meant he wasn't building Biltmore merely as a showpiece, but as a working model of progressive land management. George's social awkwardness, which made him uncomfortable in New York society, proved less of a handicap in the relatively isolated North Carolina mountains. Here he could control the social environment, entertaining carefully chosen guests who shared his intellectual interests rather than facing the constant social competition of Fifth Avenue. His shyness, a deficit in typical Vanderbilt social contexts, became an asset in dealings with local North Carolinians, who appreciated his quiet respectfulness and found him less threatening than the aggressive businessmen they might have expected. Perhaps most significantly, George possessed genuine idealism about what wealth could accomplish. While some critics dismissed Biltmore as mere self-indulgence, George articulated and pursued broader purposes. He genuinely believed that scientific forestry could benefit not just his estate, but the entire American South, demonstrating sustainable practices that could reverse decades of environmental degradation. He supported Gifford Pinchot's work not merely as an estate manager, but as a pioneering professional whose methods deserved documentation and dissemination. George's unconventional nature showed clearly in his choice of bride. In 1898, 3 years after Biltmore's opening, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. Edith was not from a wealthy family, though she had excellent social connections through her late father, a Civil War veteran and diplomat. She was intelligent, well-traveled, and shared George's cultural interests, but she brought no fortune to match his, and no social prestige beyond what the Vanderbilt name itself provided. In an era when wealthy men routinely married for social advancement or financial consolidation, George's choice reflected his prioritization of personal compatibility and shared interests over strategic alliance. Edith would prove to be an excellent choice, particularly during the challenges that lay ahead. But in 1898, George's marriage simply confirmed what his family already knew. He would not follow conventional patterns. He would pursue his own path, guided by his own values, regardless of social expectations or family pressure. This independence of mind and spirit made George Vanderbilt unusual among his peers and essential to understanding how Biltmore came to be. George's health remained a constant concern throughout his life. His respiratory issues required careful attention to climate and altitude. He suffered from what contemporaries described as nervous exhaustion, likely some combination of physical illness and the psychological burdens of managing his vast estate and navigating family expectations. These health challenges may have contributed to his scholarly nature. Extended physical activity was difficult for him, but mental pursuits were always available. They also meant that George's time at Biltmore was precious. He could never take for granted that he would have decades to enjoy what he was creating. His daily routine at Biltmore reflected his scholarly habits and interests. He rose early and spent hours in his library, reading and correspondence. He met with his estate managers to discuss forestry operations, agricultural experiments, and land management questions. He worked with landscape designers to refine plans for gardens and grounds. He entertained carefully selected guests, often engaging them in substantive conversations about literature, art, science, or politics. His lifestyle was luxurious but not dissipated. He was neither a playboy nor a social butterfly, but a serious man pursuing serious interests while enjoying the beauty he had created. George's approach to servants and employees also set him apart from typical Gilded Age employers. While he certainly expected professional service and maintained appropriate social distances, he also took genuine interest in his employees' welfare. He supported education for workers' children, provided medical care, built decent housing for estate staff, and maintained working conditions that, while hierarchical by today's standards, were progressive for their time. This reflected both his idealistic beliefs about the responsibilities of wealth and his practical understanding that quality work required quality workers, and quality workers needed decent treatment. His political views, insofar as they can be discerned, seemed moderate and progressive by Gilded Age standards. He supported Theodore Roosevelt's conservation initiatives and saw his own forestry work as aligned with broader progressive goals. He believed that great wealth carried social responsibilities, though he envisioned those responsibilities as enlightened private action rather than government redistribution. He thought wealthy individuals should serve as custodians of culture and knowledge, preserving and advancing human achievement for benefit of future generations. Yet George was not without contradictions. He believed in social responsibility, but built a private palace. He advocated scientific forestry, but enclosed tens of thousands of acres for his private enjoyment. He supported education, but lived a life of privilege that few could imagine. These contradictions were typical of Gilded Age progressive thought, a genuine desire to improve society combined with a fundamental acceptance of social hierarchies and an assumption that the wealthy were uniquely qualified to lead reform efforts. George's unconventional nature ultimately made Biltmore possible, but also contributed to the challenges it would face. A more conventional Vanderbilt might have built something smaller and more practical, something easier to maintain and eventually dispose of. But a more conventional Vanderbilt would never have conceived the vision that makes Biltmore extraordinary, the combination of architectural grandeur, landscape artistry, scientific forestry, and cultural aspiration that distinguishes the estate from mere displays of wealth. When George Washington Vanderbilt II died unexpectedly in 1914, following complications from appendicitis surgery, he was only 51 years old. He had enjoyed his creation for less than 2 decades. His death would create enormous challenges for his widow and young daughter, forcing difficult decisions about Biltmore's future. But in those 2 decades, George had proven that his unconventional approach could produce something genuinely remarkable. He had used his inherited wealth not to compete with his siblings or accumulate more fortune, but to create beauty, advance knowledge, and build something intended to endure. Understanding George Vanderbilt as an unconventional millionaire is essential to understanding everything that followed at Biltmore: its creation, its challenges, and its eventual survival. His scholarly approach, his genuine idealism, his willingness to pursue a vision regardless of criticism or convention, and his complex mixture of privilege and responsibility all shaped what Biltmore became and what it represents. He was neither a simple plutocrat building a trophy home, nor a pure altruist sacrificing for the public good, but rather a complicated individual using extraordinary resources to pursue a deeply personal vision that happened to create something of lasting value. 4. The massive land acquisition and grand vision. The story of Biltmore Estate's land acquisition reveals George Vanderbilt's ambitions at their most audacious and illustrates the complex interactions between concentrated wealth, regional economic distress, and visionary planning that characterized the Gilded Age. Between 1888 and 1895, Vanderbilt assembled approximately 125,000 acres of mountain land in North Carolina, an area roughly equivalent to 195 square miles or larger than many American cities. This vast territorial consolidation transformed the landscape, the local economy, and the very nature of land ownership in the region. George Vanderbilt's first encounter with the Asheville area came during a visit with his mother in 1888, seeking mountain air recommended for respiratory health. But what began as a therapeutic retreat quickly evolved into something far more ambitious as Vanderbilt recognized the potential of the degraded mountain landscape. The forests had been heavily logged for decades, supplying wood for the growing railroad industry and furniture manufacturing. The hillsides had been farmed beyond their capacity, with erosion scarring the slopes and streams running brown with sediment. To many observers, this was exhausted land, used up and left behind by waves of economic exploitation. Vanderbilt saw something different. Influenced by his European travels and his scholarly study of scientific forestry, he envisioned these degraded mountains restored to health through careful management. He imagined productive forests providing sustainable timber yields while demonstrating conservation principles. He pictured a grand estate that would include not just a magnificent house, but entire ecosystems under enlightened stewardship. This vision required land, enormous amounts of land, and Vanderbilt had both the capital and the determination to acquire it. The acquisition process began quietly in 1889 and continued for several years, conducted through agents to avoid the price inflation that would inevitably follow if local landowners knew that a Vanderbilt was buying. The strategy worked initially, with Vanderbilt's representatives purchasing properties at what seemed like fair market prices for exhausted mountain land. Farmers who had struggled to coax crops from increasingly barren soil found themselves offered cash for land they often viewed as barely worth holding. For many, selling to Vanderbilt's agents provided necessary capital to relocate to better land or pursue other opportunities. Yet the acquisition process was not without ethical complications and community disruption. As purchases continued and the scope of Vanderbilt's ambitions became clear, some local residents grew resentful. They saw their neighbors selling out to a northern millionaire, watched as a vast private domain took shape around them, and worried about their own futures in a region increasingly dominated by absentee ownership. Some holdouts refused to sell at any price, leading to isolated inholdings within the eventual estate boundaries. Others demanded premium prices once they realized the buyer's identity and resources. The legal complexity of these transactions was substantial. Property boundaries in the Mountain South were often vaguely defined, with many properties held under overlapping claims or unclear titles. Surveyors had to establish definitive boundaries, often discovering discrepancies between what landowners believed they owned and what legal records indicated. Water rights presented particular challenges. Who controlled streams, springs, and watersheds when ownership of surrounding land changed? Mining rights added another layer of complexity, as earlier transactions had sometimes separated surface rights from subsurface mineral claims. Vanderbilt employed lawyers and land agents full-time to navigate these complexities. They researched titles, negotiated purchases, mediated disputes, and gradually assembled the enormous holdings that would become Biltmore Estate. The cost was substantial. Estimates suggest that Vanderbilt spent over $1 million on land acquisition alone, not counting the legal fees, surveying costs, and administrative expenses involved in managing such a massive property consolidation. The acquisition strategy reflected Vanderbilt's grand vision in its geographic scope and ecological understanding. He didn't merely buy land immediately adjacent to his planned house site, but rather acquired entire watersheds and mountain ranges. He understood that proper forest management required control of complete ecosystems, not fragmented parcels. He wanted to demonstrate that large-scale scientific forestry was both ecologically sound and economically viable, and that required operating at landscape scale. This landscape-scale thinking was remarkably advanced for its time. Most American forestry in the 1890s was simply extraction, cutting trees until an area was exhausted, then moving on. European forestry had developed more sophisticated approaches, treating forests as renewable resources requiring careful management, but these methods were little known in America. Vanderbilt's vision of acquiring sufficient land to demonstrate scientific forestry at scale represented pioneering environmental thinking, even if it was enabled by extreme wealth concentration that raises its own troubling questions. The environmental condition of the land Vanderbilt acquired illustrated decades of degradation. The original old-growth forests that had covered these mountains, magnificent hardwoods including chestnuts, oaks, poplars, and hickories, had been largely removed. What remained were secondary,